Did you know that medieval university students, despite their solemn gowns and dusty scrolls, were often wilder than anything you might see today? What if I told you their lives, from the 12th to the 15th century, were a constant battle against rules they loved to break? Number 10. No weapons allowed on campus or in town. The very air around a medieval university pulsed with the energy of thousands of young men, often far from home, with little supervision from their families. These were not the quiet, studious types we sometimes imagine. They were young, often arrogant, and frequently armed. University statutes from places like Oxford, Paris, and Bologna were very clear. Students were not supposed to carry swords, daggers, or even large staffs. The reasons were obvious. Universities often found themselves in tense relationships with the towns they inhabited. The local citizens, known as townsmen or burgesses, often resented the privileges students enjoyed, such as exemption from local taxes and legal jurisdiction. Students, for their part, often looked down on the townsmen, seeing them as uneducated and beneath them. This simmering tension could explode into violent confrontations known as town and gown riots. If students were routinely carrying weapons, these disputes quickly escalated from shouting matches into full-blown street brawls. Consider the typical student arriving in a university town. He might be from a noble family, accustomed to carrying a sword as a sign of his status, or he might be from a more humble background, but still aware that a blade offered protection on dangerous roads and in rowdy inns. Many students were not just arriving to study, they were also arriving to make a name for themselves, to assert their independence. The university authorities, usually composed of masters and the chancellor, understood this. They knew that a student's sense of honor was often tied to his ability to defend himself or to challenge someone who insulted him. Despite this understanding, the rules against weapons were strict. Carrying a sword or a dagger openly was forbidden. Secretly carrying one was a different matter, and many students risked the consequences. Records from various universities show how often this rule was ignored. In the early 14th century, a student in Paris named Jean was caught by the watch with a small sword tucked beneath his scholar's gown. He claimed it was for self-defense against bandits on his journey to the city, but the university tribunal did not accept his excuse. He faced a fine and a period of suspension from lectures. Such incidents were common. Students frequently got into fights with each other, often over minor insults, women, or simply too much wine. Quick draw of a dagger could turn a drunken argument into a serious injury or even a death. The universities tried to prevent this by holding students accountable. If a student was found to have used a weapon in a fight, the punishment was severe, ranging from expulsion to a public shaming, or even a period in the university prison. The townspeople also played a role in the problem. Blacksmiths and weaponsmiths in university towns often made a good living selling their wares to students, despite the rules. Students would find ways to acquire weapons even if they had to buy them discreetly. Some students were known to carry cudgels or heavy walking sticks, which, while not blades, could still be used as formidable weapons in a street fight. The university officials tried to regulate this by inspecting student lodgings and imposing fines on anyone found in possession of forbidden arms. Yet, the appeal of being armed, of feeling powerful in a chaotic world, was strong. One famous incident occurred in Oxford in 1355, the St. Scholastica Day riot. This was a massive, bloody clash between students and townsmen. It reportedly began when students complained about the quality of wine at a tavern. The dispute escalated, and both sides, students and townsmen, quickly armed themselves. Students used bows and arrows, swords, and whatever improvised weapons they could find. Townsmen retaliated with their own weapons, and the conflict raged for days, resulting in numerous deaths on both sides. This event, Driven in part by students' readiness to arm themselves, due to the constant struggle university authorities faced in enforcing the no weapons rule. Even after such tragedies, students continued to push boundaries, knowing that a hidden dagger could be the difference in a late-night street encounter. The spirit of rebellion and self-reliance often triumphed over the stern pronouncements of the academic authorities. Number 9. Respect for university authorities and town officials. Medieval universities were unique institutions, operating under their own laws and jurisdiction, often separate from the local town government or even the king's direct authority. This autonomy was a hard-won privilege, designed to protect scholars and their pursuit of knowledge. However, it also created a peculiar dynamic. Students often felt they were above the law, especially the local town laws. The rules of conduct clearly stated that students must show due respect to the university's chancellor, rectors, deans, and masters. They also had to respect the town's mayor, aldermen, and watchmen. This was a grand ideal, but the reality was often far different. Students were a mixed bunch. Many were young aristocrats, accustomed to privilege and disdainful of commoners. Others were ambitious scholars from humbler backgrounds, but still imbued with a sense of their own importance as future leaders of church or state. They often saw university authorities as obstacles to their freedom and town officials as annoying busybodies. Stories abound of students jeering at masters during lectures, refusing to obey curfews set by rectors, or openly mocking the town watch. One common way this rule was broken involved academic disputes. A master might be giving a lecture, and a student, perhaps feeling overly confident or simply bored, would interrupt with a rude comment or a defiant question. While intellectual debate was encouraged, outright disrespect was not. If a student publicly challenged a master's authority or even worse, physically assaulted a university official, the consequences were severe. Records from Paris in the late 13th century describe a student named Roger, who after being reprimanded by his master for skipping classes, loudly insulted the master in the street, calling him a fat pig and ignorant fool. Roger was brought before the university court, where he was forced to kneel and apologize publicly to the master, then pay a large fine. His master, in turn, received a special apology from the university itself for the indignity. Clashes with town officials were even more frequent, and often more violent. Town watch responsible for keeping the peace and enforcing local laws often found themselves clashing with unruly students. Students, enjoying their clerical privileges, believed they were immune from local jurisdiction. If a student was caught breaking a town ordinance, such as disturbing the peace late at night, public drunkenness, or vandalism, they would often invoke their clerical status, demanding to be handed over to the university court, rather than the town's justice system. In Bologna, a city famous for its law school, students were particularly proud and assertive. There is a story from the early 14th century of a group of law students who, after a night of revelry, defaced a public fountain. When the town watch apprehended them, the students resisted arrest, citing their right to be judged only by the university's rector. A brawl ensued, with the students eventually overpowering the watchmen and escaping to their college. The university authorities were then forced to intervene, negotiating with the town council to avoid a full-scale riot. The students involved eventually received a stern warning and had to pay for the damages, but their defiance of the town's authority was clear for everyone to see. Students also demonstrated disrespect in more subtle ways. They might refuse to wear their scholars' gowns outside, despite university rules mandating it as a sign of their status and a way for authorities to easily identify them. They might congregate in forbidden areas, use loud and vulgar language, or engage in boisterous singing and chanting late at night, disturbing the peace of the town. The university authorities often tried to control this behavior by issuing stern decrees and imposing fines, but the sheer number of students, their youthful exuberance, and their collective sense of privilege made enforcement a constant challenge. The lines of authority were always being tested, and students in their rebellious spirit often saw it as a game to see how far they could push the boundaries of respect before facing serious consequences. This constant push and pull defined much of the relationship between students and the powers that sought to control them. Number 8. No gambling. The medieval university, for all its high-minded ideals of learning and piety, was also a place where young men, many with money in their pockets and time on their hands, could easily fall into vices. Gambling was strictly forbidden by university statutes across Europe. This rule was not just about promoting good morals, it was also practical. Gambling could lead to ruin, theft, and violence. A student who lost all his money might resort to crime or become a burden on the university or his family. Yet, like many forbidden fruits, gambling held a strong allure. Students played all sorts of games of chance. Dice games were immensely popular, often played in taverns, alehouses, or even secretly within college rooms. Cards, though less common in the earlier medieval period, became increasingly popular as the centuries progressed. Betting on sporting events, like wrestling matches, or even academic debates, was also a form of gambling. The stakes could range from a few coins to an entire semester's tuition. University authorities were constantly on the lookout for gamblers. They would conduct surprise inspections of student lodgings and patrol known trouble spots, like taverns. If a student was caught gambling, the punishment could be severe: fines, public shaming, suspension, or even expulsion for repeat offenders. However, the secretive nature of gambling made it difficult to stamp out entirely. Consider a student named Thomas in Bologna during the early 14th century. He was supposed to be studying Roman law, but much of his time was spent in a back room of a small inn near the university, playing dice with other students. Thomas, who had received a generous allowance from his merchant father, quickly developed a taste for the thrill of the game. He started small betting, a few shillings, but his bets grew larger as he chased losses or tried to press a winning streak. One evening, he lost a substantial sum, more than he had in his purse. In desperation, he borrowed money from one of the older students, promising to pay him back when his next allowance arrived. This led him down a dangerous path of debt, borrowing from one person to pay another, often at usurious rates. Eventually, Thomas's financial troubles became known to his master, who noticed his increasing distraction and declining performance in lectures. When pressed, Thomas confessed to his gambling addiction. The university authorities intervened. Thomas was lucky. His master was a kind man. Instead of immediate expulsion, he was placed on strict probation. He had to attend daily religious services, was forbidden from entering any tavern for a full year, and his allowance was controlled by the university bursar to ensure he had no extra money for gambling. This situation was not unique. Many students found themselves in similar predicaments, their academic careers derailed by the siren call of chance. The problem was so pervasive that some universities even imposed rules on innkeepers, threatening them with heavy fines or loss of their license if they allowed students to gamble on their premises, but these rules were often ignored. Innkeepers knew that students were a lucrative source of income, and turning a blind eye to a dice game was often worth the risk. Students also found creative ways to gamble discreetly. They might use coded language, play with custom-made dice that were smaller and easier to conceal, or even use their books as covers for their games. The social pressure among students also played a role. Gambling was a way to bond, to prove one's courage, or simply to pass the time in an age before widespread entertainment. A student who refused to join a game might be seen as cowardly or unsociable. This made it even harder for individuals to resist the temptation, even if they knew the risks. The authorities might crack down periodically, making a public example of a few students, But the underlying culture of gambling continued to thrive in the shadows of the hallowed halls of learning. The clash between the strict moral codes of the university and the raw human desires for excitement and quick riches was a constant feature of medieval student life. Number 7. Attend lectures regularly. The very purpose of a medieval university was learning, and at the heart of this learning were lectures. Students were expected to attend these lectures regularly, listen attentively, and engage with the material presented by their masters. However, for many students, the allure of the lecture hall was far weaker than the call of the tavern, the gaming table, or simply the desire for a bit of mischief. Skipping lectures was a common complaint among university authorities throughout the medieval period. Attending lectures was not always a comfortable experience. Lecture halls were often unheated, crowded, and poorly lit. Students sat on hard benches or even on the floor for hours at a time listening to a master read and comment on texts. There were no projectors, no fancy diagrams, just the master's voice and the text. The material itself could be dry and complex, dealing with intricate theological debates, dense philosophical arguments, or the lengthy commentaries on Roman or canon law. It took dedication and genuine interest to sit through these sessions day after day. Students found numerous excuses to miss lectures. Some were genuinely ill, a common occurrence in crowded medieval towns with poor sanitation. Others were simply bored or found the material too difficult. They might prefer to spend their time in more practical pursuits, like fencing, drinking, or pursuing local women. Some students, particularly the wealthier ones, believed their social status exempted them from the stricter routines of academic life. They paid their fees, so why should they be forced to sit through boring lectures? University statutes often mandated roll calls or attendance registers, but these were difficult to enforce rigorously, especially in larger universities with thousands of students. Masters might impose penalties for non-attendance, such as public reprimands, fines, or even a ban from taking examinations. Yet the temptation to skip was strong. Consider a student named Geoffrey in Oxford around 1300. He was studying theology, a demanding subject. Geoffrey was more interested in the social life of the university, particularly the lively debates and drinking sessions held in the local inns. He would often miss his early morning lectures on logic or biblical commentary, instead sleeping in or meeting friends for an illicit breakfast. His master, Master Edmund, noticed Geoffrey's frequent absences at first. He gave gentle warnings, then stronger ones. When Geoffrey continued his pattern, Master Edmund reported him to the proctors, the university officials responsible for student discipline. Geoffrey was summoned before the proctors and chastised for his neglect of studies. He was fined a sum equivalent to a week's lodging, and he was publicly shamed by having his name announced as a truant during a university assembly. He also received a stern warning that continued truancy would lead to his expulsion. For a short time, Geoffrey buckled down and attended his lectures, but the pull of his social life was strong and he soon started skipping again, albeit more discreetly. He would often arrive late or leave early, hoping to avoid detection. He might ask a friend to sign him in, a practice that was also strictly forbidden. The problem of truancy was so persistent that some universities even hired special officers, sometimes called collectors of fines for absentees, whose sole job was to track down students who missed lectures and levy fines. These officers were not popular figures among the student body. Students devised various strategies to avoid them, running away when spotted or finding secret routes to avoid patrol. The sheer size of the student body, coupled with the dense urban environments of medieval university towns, made it nearly impossible for authorities to catch every truant. The contrast between the ideal of the diligent scholar poring over his texts and the reality of students sneaking out of lecture halls or simply not showing up was stark. The authorities continually struggled with the balance between strict enforcement and fostering an environment where students felt encouraged rather than forced to learn. Ultimately, for many medieval students, the lure of freedom and youthful indulgence often outweighed the solemn duty to attend their lectures, proving that even in an age of strict discipline, human nature often found a way to resist. Number 6. No drunkenness or brawling. Medieval university towns were notoriously rowdy places, and students were often at the heart of the chaos. Universities, often founded with religious ideals, imposed strict rules against excessive drinking and any form of brawling or public disturbance. These rules were meant to maintain order, uphold the reputation of the institution, and protect the students themselves from injury or worse. However, alcohol was cheap and readily available, and youthful exuberance often spilled over into violence. Students drank wine, ale, and beer in vast quantities. Taverns and ale houses proliferated in university towns, catering specifically to the student population. These establishments became social hubs, places where students would gather after lectures, discuss philosophy, play games, and often drink themselves into a stupor. Drunkenness frequently led to arguments which then escalated into fights. These fights could involve students against each other, or more commonly, students against townspeople. The university statutes clearly prohibited public drunkenness, riotous behavior, and any form of physical assault. Punishments ranged from fines and public apologies to imprisonment in the university jail or expulsion. Yet, accounts from the time are full of stories of students engaging in drunken escapades and violent confrontations. Consider a student named Nicholas in Paris in the mid-13th century. Nicholas was known for his sharp wit and quick temper, traits that were amplified by alcohol. One night, after a particularly heavy drinking session at a tavern near the Rue du Fouar, where many lecturers held their classes, Nicholas got into a heated argument with a group of local apprentices. The argument started over a trivial matter, perhaps a disputed debt for a round of drinks, or a perceived insult. Words quickly turned to shoves and then to punches. Nicholas, along with his fellow students, engaged in a full-blown street brawl, overturning market stalls and drawing the attention of the town watch. When the watch arrived, Nicholas, still belligerent from drink, resisted arrest, shouting insults and even throwing a stool at a watchman. He and several of his friends were eventually subdued and taken to the town's lockup. The next morning, sober and remorseful, Nicholas faced the dual wrath of the town authorities and the university proctors. The university demanded that he be handed over to their jurisdiction, citing student privileges. After tense negotiations, he was transferred to the university prison, a cold and damp place known as the School of Repentance. Nicholas spent several days there, subsisting on bread and water. Upon his release, he was forced to pay a hefty fine to the university, compensate the tavern owner for damages, and was suspended from all lectures for a month. He was also made to perform a public penance, wearing a penitent's gown and begging for forgiveness from the town officials. Such incidents were not isolated. Brawls often broke out over women, disputed debts, or simply territorial disputes between different nations or regional groups of students. Students from different regions, like the English and the Germans in Paris, or the ultramontanes and citramontanes in Bologna, often had intense rivalries that could erupt into violence, especially under the influence of alcohol. These brawls sometimes involved dozens of students, armed with whatever they could grab: sticks, stones, even academic texts. The university authorities tried various measures to curb the drinking and brawling. They imposed curfews, restricted the number of taverns students could frequent, and even tried to control the strength of the ale brewed in town. They also employed special patrols of masters and proctors to monitor student behavior late at night. However, The sheer number of students, their youthful energy, and the widespread availability of alcohol made these rules extremely difficult to enforce consistently. Students found ways to bypass the rules, gathering in private lodgings, sneaking out after curfew, or simply finding new taverns further afield. The problem of drunken, brawling students remained a constant headache for medieval university administrations, a stark reminder of the wild and sometimes dangerous side of medieval student life. Number 5. Observe curfew. Curfews were a standard part of life in medieval university towns, designed to maintain order, ensure student safety, and curb illicit activities. University statutes usually dictated that students, especially younger ones, should be in their lodgings or colleges by a certain hour, typically around 8 or 9 in the evening, after which the town gates might be closed and the watch patrolled the streets. This rule aimed to prevent students from getting into trouble late at night, whether through drinking, gambling, brawling, or visiting forbidden establishments. Yet for many students, curfew was less a rule to be obeyed and more a challenge to be overcome. The medieval night was a dangerous place. Streets were unlit, crime was common, and there were few respectable reasons for a student to be out after dark. University authorities wanted to keep their students safe and prevent them from engaging in activities that would bring disrepute to the institution. Colleges often had porters who would lock the gates at curfew, and students caught outside risked punishment. Despite these measures, breaking curfew was a popular pastime for students seeking adventure or simply wanting to extend their social activities. The allure of forbidden nightlife, the chance to sneak into taverns or visit friends without the prying eyes of masters, was a strong motivator. Consider a student named Peter in Oxford in the late 14th century. Peter was enrolled in a relatively strict college where the gates were locked promptly at 9 p.m. Peter, however, loved to visit the local alehouses with his friends, often staying until well past midnight. To circumvent the curfew, Peter and his friends devised various strategies. Sometimes, they would bribe the college porter with a few coins or a bottle of wine to leave a back gate unlocked. Other times, they would climb over walls, using ladders or ropes they had hidden nearby. One particularly daring night, Peter and his friends managed to pick the lock on a side gate, a feat they celebrated with much glee and more ale. When Peter was eventually caught, the consequences were immediate. One chilly autumn night, after a particularly raucous session at a tavern, Peter and his friends were stumbling back to college, laughing loudly, when they encountered a university patrol. Composed of 2 proctors and several university servants, they tried to flee, but the proctors were swift. Peter was apprehended and taken straight to the provost of his college. The provost, a stern man, was furious. Peter was locked in his room for 2 days, given only bread and water. He also lost his privileges for a month, meaning he could not leave the college grounds without special permission, and his weekly allowance was halved. For repeat offenders, punishments were more severe, sometimes involving public flogging or expulsion. The university watch and town patrols would actively look for students out after curfew. They understood that these late-night excursions were often precursors to other rule-breaking activities like brawling, theft, or even sexual misconduct. The challenge for authorities was the sheer size of the student population and the labyrinthine nature of medieval towns, which offered countless alleys and hiding spots. Students became adept at navigating the urban landscape under the cover of darkness, avoiding patrols and finding secret ways back to their lodgings. Tension between the desire for freedom and the need for control was constant. University authorities frequently issued new decrees threatening harsher penalties for curfew breakers, but these often had limited effect. The thrill of defiance, the camaraderie of shared rebellion, and the simple desire for more leisure time often outweighed the risk of punishment for many medieval students. The curfew, rather than being a firm boundary, often became a line in the sand that students delighted in crossing, a testament to their rebellious spirit and ingenuity. Number 4. no women in student quarters or university premises. Medieval universities were overwhelmingly male institutions. Women were generally excluded from formal education, and their presence in student lodgings or on university grounds was strictly forbidden. This rule was deeply rooted in the moral and religious beliefs of the time, which emphasized celibacy for scholars, particularly those studying theology or canon law, and aimed to prevent any behavior that might lead to unchastity or scandal. The university authorities were vigilant in enforcing this rule, but human nature, as always, found ways to circumvent it. The prohibition was not just about avoiding sexual relations. It was also about maintaining the perceived sanctity and academic focus of the university environment. Women, particularly those not related to the students by blood, were seen as a distraction, a source of temptation that could lead students astray from their studies and into vice. However, students were young men, often far from home with natural desires. Presence of taverns, inns, and the generally looser morals of university towns compared to more rigid home environments created a fertile ground for these rules to be broken. Students were known to frequent brothels or to engage in illicit relationships with local women, including prostitutes, servants, or even local townswomen. While these activities were often carried out discreetly off campus, the more daring students would try to bring women into their rented rooms or even college dormitories. Consider a student named Roland in Bologna, a city renowned for its lively student life and a certain degree of laxity compared to more austere universities. Roland, a student of law, was quite taken with a young woman who worked as a serving maid in a local inn. Despite the strict prohibition against women in student quarters, Roland devised a plan to bring her to his room one evening. He bribed the college porter, a grizzled old man who had seen it all, with a good sum of money. He waited until late at night, after the masters had completed their rounds and most students were asleep or out themselves. He snuck the maid into his room through a back entrance, hoping to avoid detection. Unfortunately for Roland, a master on a late-night patrol heard hushed voices and suspicious movements from Roland's room. The master, suspicious, burst in. Roland and the maid were caught red-handed. The scandal was immense. Roland was immediately arrested by the university beadles and thrown into the university prison. His case was brought before the rector and the council of masters. The maid was also apprehended and faced charges under town law, likely leading to public shaming or even banishment from the city. Roland's punishment was severe. He was stripped of his academic privileges, publicly flogged in the university courtyard as a warning to other students, and then expelled from the university. His name was recorded in the university's black book, ensuring he would never be admitted to another institution of higher learning. The bribed porter also faced severe penalties, likely losing his job and facing a heavy fine. Such harsh punishments were common, reflecting the university's determination to uphold its moral authority and protect its reputation. Despite the risks, students continued to break this rule. The allure of companionship and physical intimacy was a powerful force. Some students even tried to disguise women as young boys or servants, but these ruses were often discovered by vigilant university patrols. The problem was so pervasive that universities often had dedicated officials, sometimes referred to as censors of morals, whose job was to root out such transgressions. They would conduct surprise inspections of student rooms, question suspicious characters, and even spy on students in taverns and public places. The rule against women in student quarters highlights the constant tension between the strict moral codes of the medieval university and the realities of young men living independently in a bustling urban environment. Despite the severe penalties, the rule was often broken, a testament to the powerful human desires that no amount of academic decree could fully suppress. Number 3. Speak Latin only on university grounds. For a medieval university, Latin was the language of learning, of scholarship, and of the universal church. was the lingua franca of scholars across Europe, allowing students and masters from different countries to communicate. Therefore, it was a common rule that students were expected to speak Latin on university grounds, during lectures, and even in their daily conversations within college walls. This rule was meant to immerse students in the language of their studies, improve their fluency, and reinforce the international character of the university. However, in practice, this rule was frequently and often hilariously ignored. Students came from various regions, speaking a multitude of vernacular languages: English, French, German, Italian, Spanish, and many more. While they had some training in Latin before university, very few were truly fluent in conversational Latin. They might understand academic Latin, but speaking it fluidly was another matter entirely. As soon as masters or proctors were out of earshot, students would naturally revert to their native tongues. The temptation to speak one's mother tongue was overwhelming, especially when amongst friends from the same region. It was easier, more natural, and allowed for more nuanced expression, humor, and gossip. This made the rule incredibly difficult to enforce. Consider a group of English students in Paris during the 13th century. They would sit through lectures in Latin, sometimes making notes in a mixture of Latin and English. But as soon as the lecture was over, they would spill out into the courtyard, immediately chatting in their familiar English dialect, complaining about the food, the masters, or discussing plans for the evening. The university had officials, sometimes called spies or linguists, whose job was to listen for students speaking vernacular languages and report them. One day, a student named William, known for his boisterous personality, was engaged in a lively conversation with his friends in English near the university chapel. They were laughing loudly about a particularly dull lecture. Suddenly, a severe-looking master, renowned for his strict adherence to rules, appeared seemingly out of nowhere. He had heard their English chatter. He stopped them, and in perfect, stern Latin demanded to know why they were not speaking the proper tongue of the university. William, flustered, tried to respond in halting Latin, but quickly stumbled over his words. The master, exasperated, reprimanded them harshly. William and his friends were each fined a small amount, and, as a further punishment, they were forced to recite 50 lines of Virgil in Latin, perfectly, before the master the next day. This punishment was often used, designed to both shame students and improve their Latin skills. Despite these measures, the practice of speaking vernacular languages persisted. Students would develop elaborate systems of code switching, using Latin when a master was near and immediately reverting to their native language when the coast was clear. They might even use Latin phrases to insult masters or rivals, knowing that the specific nuance of their insult might be lost on a non-native speaker. Colleges even developed silent systems, where students would signal each other if a master was approaching, allowing them to quickly switch to Latin. The rule also led to a strange form of linguistic diversity within the university. While Latin was the official language, the various accents and regional pronunciations of Latin itself could lead to misunderstandings and even jokes among students. A German student's Latin might sound very different from an Italian student's Latin. This added another layer of complexity to the enforcement of the rule. Ultimately, the rule to speak Latin only was a constant battle between the ideal of a unified, Latin-speaking scholarly community and the reality of a diverse student body eager to express themselves naturally. While it certainly helped students improve their academic Latin, it rarely prevented them from speaking their mother tongue when they thought they could get away with it. It stands as a prime example of a university rule that was universally understood, but just as universally bent, if not outright broken, by the students who lived within its walls. Number 2. No attacking townspeople or their property. The relationship between medieval universities and their host towns was often fraught with tension, a perpetual struggle for power and privilege. Students, often seen as arrogant, wealthy, and protected by their unique legal status, frequently clashed with the townspeople, who resented the students' exemptions from local taxes and laws. University rules explicitly forbade students from attacking townspeople, damaging their property, or engaging in any behavior that would disrupt the peace of the town. These prohibitions were constantly broken, leading to infamous town and gown riots that define much of the historical narrative of medieval student life. Students had many reasons to provoke the townsmen. They might feel cheated by local merchants, insulted by tavern keepers, or simply enjoy asserting their perceived superiority. Townsmen, for their part, often saw students as unruly, disruptive, and immoral. A minor disagreement could quickly escalate into a violent confrontation, particularly if alcohol was involved, or if students felt their honor was at stake. The rule against attacking townspeople was meant to prevent such large-scale conflicts and maintain some semblance of order. Punishments for breaking this rule were severe, ranging from fines and public shaming to imprisonment and expulsion, especially if a student was found guilty of assault or serious vandalism. However, the collective power of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of young armed students often overwhelmed the university's ability to control them. Consider the aftermath of a particularly heated argument in Cambridge in the mid-14th century. A group of students, feeling they had been overcharged for beer at a local alehouse, refused to pay. The alehouse owner, a sturdy man, confronted them. Words became shouts, and then one of the students, a burly young man named Robert, threw a tankard at the owner, striking him on the head. The owner's neighbors, hearing the commotion, rushed out, armed with whatever they could find: sticks, shovels, even market weights. Robert and his friends, outnumbered, fled, but not before they had overturned market stalls and smashed several windows in their retreat. The town immediately sent a formal complaint to the university chancellor. The incident threatened to ignite a full-scale riot. The university authorities were compelled to act decisively to appease the outraged townsmen. Robert was identified through witnesses and immediately apprehended. He was brought before the chancellor and a special tribunal. The evidence was clear, and Robert offered little defense. He was publicly stripped of his scholar's gown, symbolizing his expulsion from the university. He was also made to pay a large fine for damages to the alehouse and the market, and he was permanently banished from Cambridge. His companions received lesser, but still significant punishments, including fines and temporary suspensions. And such individual acts of violence were common, but sometimes they snowballed into major riots. The St. Scholastica Day riot in Oxford in 1355, mentioned earlier, began with a student argument over wine quality and escalated into a multi-day battle involving hundreds of students and townsmen, with significant loss of life and destruction of property. These riots often led to royal intervention, with the king himself having to mediate between the university and the town. Universities often lost privileges or faced severe royal displeasure when such events occurred. Students also engaged in less direct forms of aggression against townspeople and their property. They might steal produce from markets, vandalize public buildings, or engage in street harassment. The university's disciplinary system, which aimed to keep students out of the town's legal system, often found itself in a delicate dance with town authorities. The university had to show it was capable of controlling its own students, lest the king revoke their special privileges. The rule against attacking townspeople was a constant battle for medieval university authorities. It reflected the deep-seated social divisions and tensions between the academic community and the wider urban population. Despite severe consequences, the youthful arrogance, collective spirit, and sense of privilege often led students to cross this line, turning academic centers into occasional battlegrounds. The narrative of the medieval university is incomplete without understanding these frequent and often violent clashes between scholars and citizens. Number 1. Maintain honor and decency in dress and demeanor. Medieval universities rooted in a monastic tradition, placed great emphasis on outward appearances as a reflection of inner virtue and scholarly dedication. Students were expected to maintain a demeanor of seriousness, humility, and piety, and to dress in a way that reflected their status as scholars and clerics. This usually meant wearing a simple dark gown, avoiding ostentatious clothing, and refraining from boisterous or flamboyant behavior in public. This rule aimed to distinguish students from laymen, to reinforce their academic identity, and to prevent them from engaging in worldly distractions. Yet, for many young students, keen to assert their individuality and embrace the freedoms of urban life, these sartorial and behavioral rules were seen as stifling constraints to be constantly challenged. The ideal student was a modest, diligent scholar, clad in the plain scholar's gown, quietly contemplating his texts. The reality was often quite different. Students came from diverse backgrounds, and many, especially those from noble families, were accustomed to rich clothing, fine fabrics, and fashionable accessories. They resented the idea of being confined to a drab, uniform appearance. They also yearned for social recognition, to stand out from the crowd, and to attract attention, particularly from the opposite gender. The rules against extravagant dress typically prohibited bright colors, expensive furs overly tight or revealing clothing, and elaborate hairstyles. They also often forbade students from carrying swords or engaging in activities deemed unscholarly, such as excessive singing, dancing, or rowdy behavior in public. Consider a student named Giles in Bologna, a city known for its fashion-conscious populace. In the early 15th century, Giles, the son of a wealthy merchant, loved fine clothing. Despite university decrees mandating simple dark robes, Giles would often wear a tunic made of vibrant red silk underneath his scholar's gown, peeking out at the sleeves and collar. He adorned his fingers with rings, wore elaborate leather boots, and even styled his hair in the latest fashion, rather than the simple shortcut preferred by scholars. He also enjoyed public displays of exuberance, laughing loudly, singing boisterous songs, and engaging in flamboyant gestures, often drawing the attention of passers-by. Giles's behavior and attire soon caught the attention of the university censors, whose job it was to enforce such moral and sartorial rules. One afternoon, as Giles was strolling through the piazza, regaling his friends with a humorous story, a censor approached him. The censor, a grim-faced master, pointed to Giles' bright tunic and his overly styled hair, reminding him of the university's statutes on dress and demeanor. Giles, initially defiant, tried to argue that his clothes were harmless and his behavior merely youthful enthusiasm. The censor was unmoved. Giles was summoned before the university rector. He was fined a considerable sum, equivalent to several weeks of his allowance, and was given a strict warning. He was also forced to discard his fashionable clothes and wear only plain dark robes for a month. His hair was forcibly trimmed to a more modest length. For repeat offenses, students could face public humiliation, such as being paraded through the streets in penitent's clothing or even temporary suspension. Such regulations were not just about clothing. They also encompassed general conduct. Students were expected to walk with dignity, to avoid loitering, and to engage in polite, learned conversation. However, students frequently broke these rules too. They would engage in public horseplay, shout across streets, or even stage mock battles. The sheer number of students and their youthful energy often made these rules difficult to enforce comprehensively. The university constantly battled against the latest fashions and the natural desire of young men to express themselves. Decrees would be issued, punishments meted out, but the cycle continued. Students would find new ways to subtly flout the rules, perhaps with a flash of forbidden color beneath a sleeve, or an exaggerated bow that spoke of defiance. The battle over dress and demeanor was a microcosm of the larger struggle between the strict, idealized world of the medieval university and a vibrant, often rebellious reality of its students. It showed that even in an age of rigid control, individual expression and the spirit of youthful rebellion found a way to thrive.